All right, everybody. Today, at least by the time you're watching this, is in fact Absinthe Day, March the 5th. And I'm really happy and enthused to be joined by a really great old friend of mine, Ted. We go back a pretty long way. And
Well,
not just an old friend, but also one of the world's leading experts in absinthe and absinthe resurrection. And so I'm really happy to welcome Ted Breaux. Hey, man, how you doing?
good to be here. Good to see you again. It's been a while, but um, yeah, the absinthe world just it keeps rolling. And for me, it got started a very long time ago, as you know.
Yeah, yeah, let's get into that. So, just to orient folks, so that we always do the clearing up the misconceptions thing, right? So, Ted,
Mhm.
could you just say the thing you've said 50,000 times, probably more, is just sort of give folks a quick and dirty, clear definition of what absinthe is and what it isn't, maybe, and also a couple of misconceptions you want to clear up just out of the gate, so that folks are on the same page. Because I don't know about you, I still experience an enormous amount of misconceptions about absinthe in the wild, even here in North America, among people making absinthe. And so I'm still, doing trying to combat the misinformation. But could you just tell us what is absinthe, and what are some of the big misconceptions about it? Clear those up if we can.
I mean, simply put, when you strip all the mystique and all the fluff, everything away, and you look at absinthe, basically, it is a beautiful spirit distilled from botanicals. Um, it is a very concentrated spirit. It is one that is like many botanical spirits of with sufficient history. Is one that was rooted in medicinal beliefs. It is a spirit that involves a considerable amount of expertise to craft the way that it was originally intended. It's a beautiful drink. It's really not like anything else. Of course, once upon a time, because it was so popular, um, that created some issues, especially back in the day when when everything was caveat emptor and there were no regulations. Um, and basically, that's absinthe in a nutshell. And is what it is not. It is not a drug. It is not a hallucinogen. It is not poison, not if properly constructed. It um, it's something that's been so misunderstood and so deliberately um, mischaracterized and exploited. And basically, a long time ago, years and years ago, it was difficult to study anything about absinthe without being just inundated in misconceptions and myths and inaccuracies. And but today, there's no excuse. I mean, there's no excuse to repeat misinformation. I mean, it's too good information is as easy as a Wikipedia article. I mean, who can't do that? Um, for someone to repeat myths that have long since been conclusively debunked, myths that don't fit any science whatsoever, it's just irresponsible. It is.
I agree, and it's amazing that some of these papers, published by folks like yourself, have been out there in the wild for 20 years, and still the misinformation manages to stay apace with the information. Uh, Ted, at a base level, what goes into absinthe? Where if you're looking at it from a production point of view, what actually is constitutive of absinthe? What makes it, from a botanical point of view and alcohol point of view? What's going into it?
Well, starting from a botanical point of view, we start from absinthe's namesake botanical, which is Artemisia absinthium, also known as grand wormwood, which is native to Europe, and it's a like many botanicals, it has a medical history. Um, it is also something that is very, very, very bitter, strongly, strongly bitter. And it's been known for a very long time. I'm talking since the Renaissance era, at least, that one can neutralize the bitter flavor of Artemisia absinthium by macerating it in alcohol and distilling it. And the practice of distilling absinthe and anise, Pimpinella anisum, green anise, goes back at least as far as the 1600s. In fact, Nicholas Culpeper's Complete Herbal, which was the um, seminal volume, been reprinted so many times, and it was basically the first sort of botanical kind of medical book that was published in English, so commoners could read it. I mean, Culpeper mentions distilling absinthe with anise seeds, so we know that practice goes way, way back. It's just that over the years, over the decades and centuries, actually, this became refined. Same way that distilling juniper back, we know that that happened in the Middle Ages. Same way, and we know that distilling it with certain other complementary botanicals made resulted in something that we know as today is gin. So the same thing happened with absinthe over the years. Um, Absinthe was refined into something that was not only palatable but delicious, good tasting medicine, so to speak. And that was the fact that it was rooted in medicinal preparations. Of course, gave everyone excuse to drink it and drink um, more copious amounts of it than they probably should have. Um, origins are complex, also compounded by the prevailing belief in France that alcohol that was derived from fruit like grapes was not injurious to the system, and absinthe was traditionally distilled from brandy grape alcohol. So you had all the perfect storm of excuses to overdo it on absinthe.
Right. And I guess that sort of gets us to the next thing is um today is Absinthe Day, at least the day that this is airing. And that means that absinthe got re-legalized, right? And you played a decisive role in that process. Could you just briefly say how it got banned and how it got re-legalized in a pretty brief way? We've covered this in some previous discussions we've had on the channel, and folks can maybe check those out. But just to bring folks up to speed, there's a really complex history of their politics and the temperance movement and phylloxera and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But what does that look like in terms of the history and then the sort of rebirth of absinthe in the mid aughts?
Well, I use this analogy a lot because it helps put things into perspective. And that is in the mid 1700s, there was a big problem in London called the gin craze. And gin was given a nickname, Mother's Ruin. Okay. And even Hogarth made these sketches depicting gin lane and beer alley and showing the difference. So, you drink beer, you're okay. You drink gin and your life goes to ruin. Does that sound familiar? I mean, basically what happened with absinthe a century and a half later, or a little over a century later, is it's a remarkable parallel. And basically what you do is you have something that becomes very, very popular, but um, producing absinthe is expensive. And of course, whenever something is expensive and popular, and usually initially at least reserved for classes of people that were financially capable, um, there's always a drive to make it cheaper. And back in those days, when there were no laws and no regulations when it comes to food and beverage, I mean, basically, it was a whole world of buyer beware. And the poor alcoholics that were having problems because they were imbibing copious amounts of fake absinthe, fake synth, if you will. And this created a lot of problems primarily for this subset, this cultural subset. And, and of course, the debate was fueled by absence economic competitors, which were brandy and wine. And here in the United States, there was even the effect that was, of someone developing all sorts of problems as a result of absinthism. Okay. But, the funny thing is when you look at anecdotal reports and such. And here in the United States, people in the United States didn't suffer from absinthism. This phenomenon did not take place on these shores. Why is that? Well, I can explain that by the simple reality that the cheap stuff, the adulterated stuff, wasn't exported. I mean, that probably never even left France. But meanwhile, absinthe that was respectable, finely crafted, was exported worldwide. Absinthe was banned in the United States during the height of the controversy that was happening in Europe, and basically it was done so as a preemptive measure. You know, it's like we've heard about this green curse of France, and let's stop it because it's getting a foothold here. I mean, it already had. Absinthe was quite popular. Early cocktail books, which I love, oftentimes absinthe appears in those cocktail books. It was on every good bar, and so that was done. That it was banned, not because of any problems that were being caused, but the belief that it could cause a problem. And really, it's during that period of time, almost a century here in the U.S., that absinthe was banned. It's only really when it was banned that so many of the persistent myths really gain momentum. And of course, when there's none of it around and there's only speculation, well, that's just fertile grounds for all sorts of ridiculousness, which happened. And, early on when I got into this, which was around the end of 1993, it was a long time ago. I mean, that's all there really was. When I started studying absinthe back in the 90s, just like so many people, I assumed by default that there was at least some truth to what was believed about absinthe, what was the alleged, psychoactive qualities or poisonous stuff. And that's how I got into this. I wanted to know I'm a research scientist. I was an working as, with some analytical chemistry in a lab. I wanted to know what the problem was. That's how I got involved in this. And, in reality, talking about National Absinthe Day, which is kind of celebrated on some scale worldwide, these days, it in the U.S., which had the longest effective standing ban on absinthe, it really wasn't even about, it was about perception more than anything. It wasn't even about, the U.S. regulators, they pretty much come to the conclusion that there's nothing wrong with absinthe. They knew that, but it was about perception. And their biggest concern was a producer capitalizing on misconceptions and myth to promote a very bad product. And that had happened in Europe. And, at the time when you and I met many years ago, that was the situation. In fact, one of the things that got me and really inspired me to do what I do is because what was being sold as absinthe in the market, anywhere that you could find it, like in Europe, was just complete rubbish. And you remember that. Virtually every absinthe product out there. The best thing you could do was to have something that was like cold mix from oils with green dye in it. And that was, the best products that were out there were that. The worst ones were just some alcohol with some powdered herbs being added to the bottle and all kinds of marketing nonsense and lies. And it was disgusting. So,
Ted, how did you get plugged into this, right? So you're, like as you said a minute ago, you're an analytic chemist, interested in absinthe there in the 90s and the aughts. So how do you plug into the turning the switch back on for absinthe?
I'm an outlier. I just happen to be the right person in the right place at the right time. I'm working as an environmental microbiologist and chemist in a private lab. I'm from New Orleans. I've seen the word before. I've walked down Bourbon Street and seen the sign says the old Absinthe House, a bar that's been in operation since 1874. And I happened to come across a book catalog that was sent to me in the mail that had Barnaby Conrad's fine book, Absinthe History in a Bottle. That was published in 1988 and with one glaring exception, is remarkably accurate, an amazing piece of research done well before the internet existed. Um, and it was me. It was absinthe was mentioned to me in a passing, like several. It was a perfect storm of events that happened all in like the same week. I got this book catalog in the mail. I saw the old Absinthe House sign, and I had a colleague of mine mentioned it. Oh, absinthe, yeah, something. No, and I was like, whoa, stop everything. Okay, what exactly was this? And his response was, this guy's a brilliant chemist. He said, oh, it was that green liquor that made people crazy. Okay, really? And the thing is, back then, I even went to the library, went to the chemistry library. I mean, I was looking for any bit of information I could find. I read Barnaby Conrad's book like 3 times inside a week. I even wrote him a letter, remember, for email, and he responded. Super nice guy. I had questions, and he told me, "Oh, everything I know is in the book." Um, but I wanted to know what it was. If this stuff was really bad, why? It's that simple. That simple. I wanted to know why. But the thing is, I can't study absinthe unless I have it. And fortunately, at the time, I had a couple of nice Buki Rotavaps. So I had a way to make it experiments, and then just a couple of years later, by as if lightning struck twice in the same place. I mean, I had 2 bottles of vintage absinthe basically fall in my lap, and that for me, that was a Rosetta Stone. Not only did I have absinthe to study, I had vintage absinthe to study.
Mhm.
So, and that started a wave of experiments, of analytical studies and distillation, and even me involving a third-party lab and got them to recalibrate their equipment to run, absinthe samples over a weekend. I mean, I wanted to know why, and I wasn't going to let up until I had the answers, which took a while to get with confidence.
Right. And then eventually this leads into you not only doing the analytical chemistry side of things, but also, and this is to really zoom in on the topic for today, is really not only recreating absinthe as a sort of an abstract beverage, but also recreating versions of vintage absinthe, right? Vintage marks. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's where I want to zoom in the conversation, because it sort of connects to the later thing that I'm going to be doing with Adrian, which is sampling some vintage Pernod
Mm-hmm.
Edouard, along
Mm-hmm.
with your reproduction of Pernod Edouard. And that's where I guess I want to zoom in there. Um, if I remember correctly, the first absinthe that you produced commercially was Nouveau Orleans, and
Mm-hmm.
then Pernod Edouard was the first one that you reproduced. That is to say, sort of resurrected from the dead. And that's part of, I think, the reason why that is because that's one of the bottles that you had, right? Was the Pernod
Yes.
Edouard was one of the bottles that you had.
Yes. So, okay. So basically, there was a um, just I would call it a paradigm shift almost in June of 2000, and that was when when I got a third party lab to corroborate what I found out, and that all this Thujone stuff, that's all BS. That's all nonsense. Um, and I would, in vintage absinthe did not contain a lot of it, and it's not hallucinogenic anyway.
Mhm.
So I hate even mentioning that word, because, I go somewhere and talk about absinthe, someone always brings it up, but it's insignificant. Um, but around that time, when I had run all these samples of vintage absinthe, which I had a good several by that point in time, and then later on, I ran more as I came across them, and basically, I came to a point where it's like, okay, I've got I have enough detailed scientific information to write a really good book, okay, which would be cool. But what would be better, infinitely better, would be for me to take this information, to use it to reverse engineer original products, at least the ones that I felt like I had enough information to do accurately,
Mhm.
and release and bring that to the world. So that became my mission, beginning back in in like, late 2000. And one of the first vintage bottles that came into my hands was, I mean, it's almost impossible to believe, but a colleague of mine, not someone that worked in the lab, but worked in the main office, brought, when he found out I was interested in absinthe, he was like, yeah, wait a minute. He goes, oh, I think I've got a bottle of that. I was like, yeah, okay, right. Sure you do. And he was like, I'm going to bring it. It's okay. And he brought, when you and I think of Edward Pernod, we think of this, the European, the French market version. This is a unopened bottle. We think of the 65% Edward Pernod. That was the third largest absinthe in the world. I say largest seller, but the funny thing, and it was imported to the U.S. as well, Edward Pernod. But this bottle that my colleague produced was a little bit different. The bottle that he had, which, according to what he knew in his family, this has been bought by his great grandfather, and if I remember this correctly, who is on holiday, I think, in Cuba around 1900. And it was the export strength Edward Pernod, 72%. Basically, this was the IPA of absinthe. And I don't recall, off the top of my head, don't get me wrong, because sometimes my memory makes mistakes, but I don't recall ever seeing another export strength version of a French or Swiss brand. I mean, the best absinthes were exported, definitely. But this was export strength specifically.
Yeah, I think I've heard that they bumped up the percentage higher because of travel, especially in the tropics, meant more evaporation to the corks. So you
definitely right. You definitely get more temperature variation, things like that, whatever, and more humidity. But anyway, point is it was definitely stronger, more concentrated, and I've always felt that the 65%, which is better than the 60%, and I've had that too, and the 72% is just a step even better. Mm-hmm. And I had enough information, not just the original bottle and not just all the pertinent information I needed from the liquid, but also had a lot of information about the distillery and all the botanicals used by the distillery. I knew where they got most of their botanicals. I knew the equipment. I knew the alembic stills they had. I knew how those stills were fitted. So I felt like I had a good, and I had a good handle on things. But when I had the actual bottle and that liquid, and I was able to analyze, we never even opened that bottle. If I remember correctly, I think we just drew samples through the cork. Mm-hmm. Yep. So, but being able to taste it, which fortunately it was in excellent intact condition, and analyze it, that was an eye opener. I thought it was a beautiful product. I still do. I've never seen another bottle anywhere. So obviously it was exported. So the place where you're most likely to find vintage absinthe is Europe, but you're not going to find that one. It was an export product. Right. So it's incredibly rare. As far as, like I said, I've never seen another one. May not be. It wasn't actually mine.
Does he still have it?
I haven't spoken to him in years. He may still have it. I would think that he would. I think I may have a sample still. It's hard for me to remember. I went through Hurricane Katrina and all that, so it's hard for me to remember what I have and don't have. But I may still have a small sample of that. But that was a huge inspiration. And Nouvelle Orleans, remember, I went from distilling on a scientific scale to the Combier distillery in France. I went from high precision, very small scale scientific equipment to copper stills from the 1880s in a distillery that was fitted by Gustave Eiffel, and scaling up 200 times, by a factor of 200 times. So Nouvelle Orleans, yes, I released first because since that's part vintage absinthe and part my discretion, what I would have done if I were a distiller in the 19th century, that's Nouvelle Orleans. At least I had some fudge factor, and I had about 2 weeks to crash course in working out the differences. And then once I understood those differences and I felt confident, then I was able to move and recreate the that original Edouard. Yes.
And so, what about the Edward drew you to it, aside from just accessibility to the chemistry? Obviously, you had at that point there were a few samples jumping around, and you've recreated many of those. But why did you jump to the Edward first? What about it as not just sort of an experiment in analytic chemistry or an experiment in sort of forensic chemistry reproducing things, but is there anything about that particular beverage that you thought, when I want people to experience authentic absinthe for the first time, I want it to be that one, as opposed to the Big Mark Pernod Fils or CF Burger or other ones which you
Right.
have which you have reproduced. But is there anything about that one that when you was it drawn straws, or you were like, no, there's something about this one that I really am drawn to?
I I can't say that the reasoning why I did that. I mean, there was no like from my going from my memory. I didn't agonize over this. Um, I could at that point I very well could have done Jade 1901. You know, the Pernod Fils replica. I could have done that first. Um, but I really, or I could have done the burger. You know, the Jade 1890, VS 1898, CF burger. I could have done that. I chose the board, and I think maybe it was because it was like the first. Um, it wasn't the first vintage bottle that I had, but it was the first pre-band bottle
Hmm.
that I had. So the the other first bottle that I had was an early Pernod Tarragona bottling, an early one with the blob seal and
Right,
for,
30s.
for yeah, yeah, 20s or 30s, sometime during the mid-war year, between the wars. Anyway, I could have done any of those, but I think maybe I chose it looking back because it was the first pre-band bottle that I really was able to get my hands on. And it's funny because I remember seeing in Europe, I think it might have been in a museum, maybe in Pontarlier, or maybe it was in Switzerland. There is a letter from the U.S. consulate to Mr. Edward Pernod, and it's funny because it's all in French, and it says, if you export any more absinthe to the U.S., we're going to have to give you your own embassy. So, and also, I liked it because it was a product it was um, one of three products that were, and quite a lot of Edward Pernod. I mean, one of three products that were exported en masse to North America, and definitely it might have even exceeded Pernod Fils. Edward Pernod seems to turn up old bottles that seem to turn up at least as much as Pernod Fils in North America.
Hmm.
Empty bottles, but
Right,
Edward Pernod bottles nonetheless.
right. And vis-a-vis sort of comparing Edward Pernod to other marks, right? Pernod Fils, Berger, Ajuno, whatever the ones that have survived, the ones we know something about. What about it stands out to you? What and people often think like I give people some absinthe, they're like they'd all taste the same. It's just like anise, and I'm like no, 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 no. Right? There's a lot going on here. There's significant differences in the botanical ratios, or even the various botanicals that are involved. And I'm wondering if you were to say sort of what stands out to you about Pernod Edward as a pre-ban absinthe versus Pernod Fils or the others. Anything particularly stand out? And for instance, I think of Marc Voulier, who's the one of the was I think one of the premier um hunters of vintage bottles. Really focuses on the what he calls the masculine punchy anise of Pernod Edward, and I tend to agree. I find it to be a very anise forward, very floral, very punchy kind of absinthe, as opposed to the Pernod Fils, which is a much, I think, better blended absinthe in the end, but in some ways less less extravagant. The Burger's famous for its sort of baby powdery
Hmm.
finish and things like that. So,
Yep.
what are the kind of things that stand out to you about the Pernod Edward?
It has a certain, I like the botanical balance of, um, of that a little bit more. I think, you know, to someone that doesn't drink red wine, they all taste the same.
Mm.
Someone who doesn't drink red wine, I mean, they probably wouldn't be able to appreciate the difference between something you bought in a regular supermarket with, versus Chateau Latour. So, they all taste like red wine. That's true. Um, absinthe all tastes like absinthe. Well, that's a good start. True. But, it's like anything else. The more you drink it, when I first started studying absinthe, I was hugely disappointed to find out that absinthe tasted like anise. I had an aversion to it. Of course, today I taste something completely different. So it's a matter of, palate refinement. And with respect to that, I've always felt like I slightly preferred the botanical balance and Edward Pernod to Pernod Fils. And really, they have more similarities and differences, not by accident. Um, but I've always felt that, whereas Pernod Fils could be something maybe a little more, perhaps one could say maybe it's a little more approachable, in its balance and finesse. I do think I do find that Edward Pernod has a certain botanical edge to it. I'm acting as if I don't know what it is, but yeah, I do. It's just that the way that it's done, and it's the distillation, of course, is is pretty close, but there are a little bit of differences. But it's just the way it's put together. I felt that if anything, the original Edward Pernod, and then reflected in Esprit Edouard, I feel that it's a little. If I were put it this way, I know how to describe it in context. If I were going to use it in a very um, boozy cocktail like a Sazerac, I think it's a very good fit. Whereas whereas maybe something like Pernod Fils, I would might drink it in the continental way in an absinthe glass and whatever. But I think Edouard, and especially the export strength version with that added concentration, I feel is really nice to make in making some of these classic cocktails. I feel it works very, very well.
Because the rye would drown out the Pernod Fils. It's a bit too delicate in that way.
Yeah, I mean, Edward's got some real backbone, and the beauty is you can have the flavor of it, and it doesn't. It's not candy. It's got enough botanical structure that it can work well, and it's not that Pernod Fils doesn't work well in Sazerac. Sure, it does. I like Edward. I feel like it just has a touch of an extra dimension that I feel is well suited um, to that. Actually, um, it's something that, uh, if I'm going to drink like an absinthe frappe, okay, maybe Pernod Fils, something like that. But I like Edward cocktails.
Hmm. It's good to
So
know.
yeah,
That's an interesting thing I think out there because there are people who are buying absinthe as a cocktail, uh, as part of a cocktail equipment, right? As opposed to people like me who I don't drink much in the way of cocktails, and I tend to drink absinthe in the more traditional way. And so it's an interesting kind of distinction about what you might buy depending on what your interests are, in terms of how you're using or drinking, consuming your absinthe.
one question I'm asked all the time is, okay, you've got several Jade absinthes. Which is your favorite? It's like, okay, there's not enough information to answer that question. Basically, um, the more specifically, you can ask me what's my favorite if I'm doing blank with it, because what I would choose, um, or whether it's Jade or vintage, it depends on what I'm doing with it.
Mhm.
So that entirely factors into to what I'm doing. In the
So
same
maybe
way that
answer that question, Ted. With each jade, what is your favorite way to use them? I'll ask it the other way around, to see if I could to probe the question a little deeper. With each jade, what is your preference to have? How do you prefer to consume them?
Well, as I just said, I like Esprit Edouard and Sazeracs. Okay, I also like Jade Nouvelle Orleans and Sazeracs, but it gives it a different twist. It makes it a bit avant garde. It gives it a touch of something that's unique. Now, if something like Nouvelle Orleans, I can drink in a glass with just a like a big whiskey, you know, big piece of whiskey ice in it, um, and that works. Something like something like Pernod Fils, straight up continental absinthe glass, the whole absinthe ritual, perfect for that, iconic for that. And something like CF Burger, I like in a frappe. I like in something that's going to end up a little bit, and in something that's going to a concoction that's going to be a little bit maybe sweet in the end. And I find that makes it also has a little bit of structure. It lends a nice balance to that. So in a
It's
nutshell,
a bit more of a dry absinthe in the end. I think that
yeah,
burger.
it it's really that one and that one. I could go on about that one. That one is a bit of a that one's a little bit tough to get right. To get it, you walk a fine line in doing it, and I know it's tough to get it right. Let me just tell you that all of these distillers in pre-ban times, of course, they were doing this day in day out for decades and decades, and I have a lot of respect for them. I really do. Obviously, what I do is on a much smaller scale, and that presents certain challenges inherent to that and to the difference in scale. But what they did is just it's remarkable. I mean, I have a lot of respect. Of course, they had a lot of time to get it, to get it right and have a
Generations of family.
I mean, really to have a well-oiled machine. And the thing is, and one of the things that, even though they're all long dead, I've learned a lot from the original distillers. I've come to a lot of crossroads that one would never encounter unless they're in a production setting like I am. And it's like, there's things I've just always go, oh man, I never thought about this. Now, what would they have done? And usually, if you think the thing that makes the most economic, uh, the thing that's most economically efficient is going to be the right answer. And I can't blame them for that.
Mm.
But yeah, but there's a lot of art in it. And you didn't ask me about Terminus Oxygenae,
Oh,
but
ask you
that's
about
another
all of them. Yeah, ask you about, yeah.
that's another one. Yeah, I don't have it in the U.S. market. I may change that soon though. That's another topic. But that one, yeah, I kind of like that one all the way around. I think it works. I think it does. I would grab that for anything. Be perfectly honest. Um, I
Yeah, that's one I need to come back to. I've only had it once. I bought a bottle several years ago, and the others, it's funny. I'm part of a very small club. Is that I get to see these develop and change over the the research and development process. So it's fascinating to watch them develop, with the exception of the terminus. I wasn't part of that one in any respect. So it was interesting seeing these come into being at the same time that you and I sometimes are sitting across the table in New Orleans with vintage absinthe, being like, ah, yeah, like you did it, like it's you have to strip away the paint of 100 years of a bit of chemistry, and I want to ask about that in a bit more in a minute. But
mhm.
it was a really amazing process. Ted, without revealing trade secrets, which I know you won't do, um, what did the process of recreating some of these look like? If you kind of walk through it, maybe from a layman's chemistry up to the production there at Combier. What does
Mhm.
that look like without revealing more than you feel comfortable revealing?
Well, as you know, absinthe changes in the bottle over time,
Mhm.
and the vintage absinthe we drink now didn't. It tasted a bit different when they drank it um, a century ago. So one of the things that does, is, unlike whiskey, and I've never really analyzed whiskeys, although vintage whiskeys, although I know of people who do. Um, Absinthe changes. The thing is, when something changes, that presents it's almost like a moving target. But on the other hand, when something changes, it doesn't disappear. It becomes something else. So um, for me, it was a matter of remember, I was looking for what it was that was alleged to be poisonous, deleterious, toxic, hallucinogenic, whatever. So I was looking at everything that was, everything of significance that was in it. And in doing that, I was able to put together a pretty good picture of the composition of each of these vintage absinthes and looking for what was wrong with them, which, by the way, I never did find because it didn't exist. Um, but I was able to put a good sketch together. And the thing is that coupled with the supporting information I had about the types of distillation equipment, the botanicals that they, I mean, which I knew, but but where they were sourced, that matters. It doesn't work. I tell people it's not just, it's not just important with grapes, but where you botanicals come from. It, yes, it matters, and that's a whole other topic. My gosh, but I was able when I realized how much information that I had amassed, that I was like, hey, with all this, I can cut and try, test, 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 cut and try, and I can keep doing this until I've got it right. Um, because it's not like I had written protocols for any of these. And they had been like recipes that you could find on the internet, whatever. And that, yeah, well, a lot of that was just not accurate.
It's a blind
Uh,
alley, that stuff.
yeah, there's a lot of generic stuff out there that people have made up, and then it's repeated as something it's not, and whatever. But the thing is, for me, it was, um, and I could get so close, I could get close to a point doing things the way that I was doing this when I was analyzing. It really wasn't until I had I was producing absinthe using the original equipment, um, using botanical source from the original regions, and doing it on an ongoing process, that I was able to get even a step closer than where I had started originally. So yeah, I mean, I had the benefit of being in control of a mass spectrometer and gas chromatograph, and I was using these instruments, which were intended to analyze contaminated water samples, and I was using them to analyze antique liquor. And it was, like I said, from all that information that I amassed, that taught me about not only about the composition of all these products, and to some extent of how those products change over time, but also taught me at the same time that there was nothing wrong, because there's nothing poisonous, there's nothing wrong in there.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that was a paradigm shift. And the first time I realized that, there is nothing wrong with absinthe, so long as it's made correctly. It's not like gin. There's nothing wrong with it. And that was for me, that was a aha moment. And that started a whole paradigm shift that, we've continued from around that point to the day to today. And you remember in those early days, trying to tell people there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it was like swimming uphill.
No, it was terrible. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, tell people, yeah, having a glass of absinthe with a buddy of mine, they're like, "Oh God, you're gonna die." Like,
Yeah. That's, oh my gosh. What are you doing to yourself? Right.
yeah, I think I'll be fine. I guess the last question I have for you, Ted, just on a more analytic question, is about the question about aging. And one of the things that I think one of the things that's often surprising is that even if you've had a vintage absinthe or a pre-ban absinthe, and actually have one just behind me there. It's an old bottle of Pernod Ward produced in Spain. And one of the things that you'll find is that 3 bottles, 3 absinthes. How they got stored, whether they stored on their side or upright, whether they were stored
Mhm.
in good in darkness, whether they were stored in various. It's not just the age, but the environment in which they age can dramatically affect the absinthe, and it can be shocking, right? I've had 2 bottles of Pernod Ward, both produced in Spain in the 20s. Even looking at them, one's clearly darker than the other, one's fresher than the other. It's amazing the range. And so I often tell people, like, yeah, if just because you've had one doesn't mean you've had it, because it's amazing in terms of cellar conditions or whatever. And I guess one of the outstanding last questions I'll pose to you is that it seems to me that one of the sort of wild wests of in the absence study, at least at the chemical level, is what's going on in the bottle with age, and to what degree does exposure to light, exposure to heat, storage upright or on the side, um, how much does evaporation affect change, right? Because we're seeing you see bottles, vintage bottles and pre-ban bottles with levels all over the place. And so from your chemistry work, one, to what degree do you have a handle on what's going on in the bottle with age, and two, um, would it be worthwhile recreating that process artificially? In the world of alchemy, they talk about what can be done by art and what can be done by nature. And the alchemists always said, well, we can do whatever nature does by art. We can accelerate the process. We can do X, Y, Z. It's, the alchemists are always like, it takes the Earth millions of years or thousands of years to cook gold in the Earth, but we can make it in the lab. They were wrong, but they were, wrong for the right reasons. And I'm wondering about the aging process and what you can reveal from your chemistry stuff, your chemistry and your analytics side about the aging process. Um, but also, would it be worth? Because I will say that I've had really fresh vintage absinthe, still green, still whatever, and I've had stuff that's not such great levels of preservation, and I tend to prefer the stuff that's not so well preserved sometimes. Um, it kind of gives it a kind of leathery, cognac-y kind of dimension that the more fresh stuff, while alpine and beautiful, is still lovely in its own way. So I guess those are the two questions. One is, what do we know about the science of the aging process of absinthe, which is unique at some level to absinthe? And also, to what degree do you think that's reproducible, or would you want to? Would that be an interesting challenge, or have you done it in terms of reproducing the chemical changes to produce an absinthe in an hour that would mirror that 100-year change?
Well, first of all, the old distillers, what they tell us in their writings is pretty much what um, I figured out right away, and that is there is a initial aging process, or I should say resting process, because it involves very little age that happens within a matter of months, and then there's a change that's at least as great that well, eventually it'll be greater, that happens over a long period of time. So, and being fully aware of this is one of the reasons why, a bottle of Jade has about 3 years on it on average. Actually, in Terminus Oxygenate, I didn't even release that until it had 6 years of age on
Hmm.
it. Okay. No one does that today, but that was always done back then, and for good reason, for those reasons. Now, okay, well, as you know, you find a bottle of vintage absinthe, it could be a crapshoot.
Mhm.
You might have something that tastes remarkably fresh. I mean, it seems like I remember tasting one or two things that were fresh enough to where I doubted their their provenance.
Yeah, the cash that he found in the barn, I remember, was so green and so fresh that I was like, "This isn't vintage absinthe." He's like,
Yeah,
"Yeah,
I'm.
it just sat in a barn."
Is it? It's like, what kind of taste? It tastes really fresh. Anyway, yes, that, and then I've had some that were just so badly oxidized. They were just absolutely limp and had no life left in them. And of course, there's a lot of things in between. I've had antique chartreuse as well, which it also ages, a little bit over time. So what I can tell you is that, well, first of all, the primary aging factor is oxidation, and these corks, unfortunately, especially when these driven corks used to seal vintage absinthe bottles, is a very imperfect seal over time. That high alcohol content really tears up those corks after a long period of time, and yes, and they breathe, and you get ullage, and that's why we see unopened bottles that are half empty. Angels have been drinking quite a bit of it, but when that happens, and you get a greater head of oxygen there over time, yes. When you can put something into a wine cellar and it's a constant temperature, um, and so you don't have that fluctuation in temperature. I mean, those bottles seem to do very, very well. But can the age be replicated? I've never attempted to put the equivalent of 100 years of age on a bottle of absinthe. You know, I mean, people have tried this with everything from wine to whiskey, as far as to artificially age something, and th- for numerous reasons, it's only you know marginally successful, but it's not quite the same thing. Have I ever done it with absinthe? No, I haven't had a real interest in doing it only because I know that 100 years ago people, weren't drinking 100-year-old absinthe. But
Right.
yes, absinthe as it ages, it does become more amalgamated. It does. One of the things that, and people ask me, how does vintage absinthe taste different? It's like, well, the flavors of that from the anise and the fennel become very rounded. The whole thing gets this sort of honey, almost butterscotch note to it. Is it all becomes highly integrated, and it still tastes like absinthe, but it's much softer. And of course, it can soften to a point whereby it's flabby. But I've never put a heck of a lot of thought into it. I mean, it was enough for me just to be able to do what I was doing. Um, and I would think it's surprising, because I say surprising. I mean, maybe not, but I would think if anything, that terminus oxygenae would would have a relatively accelerated aging pattern as compared to the others. Um,
Because of the
because
oxygenation process.
Yeah, because of proprietary process, which is dangerous, and I have to get everybody out of the way when I do it. But it's I would think that with that kind of oxidative pressure, that would accelerate the aging process, and it definitely gives it a bit of a different character. But it's not the same as something that's sat in a bottle and forgotten in a wine cellar for a century. So I, that remains something that those waters I have not tested. I don't have a whole lot of faith that that would be able to be replicated. Um, I don't know, maybe to some extent. I have an idea of a process that maybe if there's a process that would have a chance, I have an idea of one that might work. But then again, it might work to an extent, but it probably never be the same.
Right. It's the kind
Uh,
of thing that I imagine most analytic chemists out there aren't trying to study how chlorophyll breaks down in high proof spirits over the course of 100 years in wine alcohol or whatever. It's not a very you can't imagine Merck or whatever trying to. They're not going to make a lot of money out of that.
Well, and really, the chlorophyll changes the color, which if you saw that happening, well, at least you knew you had something that wasn't artificially colored, which
Right.
back in the day that's a good thing.
Yeah.
It
You don't
doesn't change.
copper sulfate in your absinthe.
You're right, right. It didn't change the flavor, but there are other compounds in there that polymerize, oxidize, and whenever they undergo any sort of chemical change like that, it definitely impacts the flavor. Um, and it seemed like there was something I wanted to add to that. I'm trying to think of what it was. But look, I mean, and people have asked, oh, can you make it taste like like it's 100 years old? No, I just don't have a way to do that. I don't. Um, I was delighted that I came across another thing too about absinthe is there's something For example, I can pull one old mark that I'm familiar with, CF Burger, which I did reverse engineering project on that, and then later I found handwritten notes from the distillery that confirmed that what I had um, determined from my analysis was accurate. So that was good news. But there's somebody that, and that is one, probably the most notable one. I I have a strong suspicion that toward the end, and most of the vintage absinthe you find really is toward the end of the era. Um, Most of the pre-ban that you find is toward the end. It's like who not many people come across a bottle mid 19th century, something or another. But like that one, for example, I think they changed the recipe right around the end. And I suspect that they may not be the only one, but I think that's a particular glaring example. And I'm not the only one that's noticed this. I just thought it was weird.
Yeah.
And maybe that was because of the looming ban, or maybe that was because they wanted to try to, um, when the absinthe industry saw its head being put into the guillotine, I imagine that maybe there were some, 11th hour changes to try to say, hey, we're going to make our product more hygienic, or or I don't know, but
Which is weird because that's like the third biggest mark, and I think the biggest one in Switzerland, which were famous for their high quality and all that. But I guess also being in Switzerland, they faced their own unique challenges because they got banned earlier.
yeah,
So maybe it isn't
1910.
Right. So, and I've
Mhm.
heard people say, and I think I've experienced this too, that French made Pernod Edward is, in my opinion, a more subtle animal than Spanish made Pernod Edward before
Oh
Pernod
yeah,
Fils bought the factory.
all the way
Uh,
around.
yeah, I think it's a much more tame animal, and it's like it to me, and I think it has a lot to do with the fact that they're getting the anise way closer, way fresher. That because from my experience, anise is mostly coming from that region of Spain, anyhow.
Alicante, yeah.
Yep.
Well, well, look, I mean, Jose Banus did a good job in making those products under contract, but they were not the same.
Right.
And and I'm far from a literary expert. I want to say it's Ernest Hemingway, and I want to say it's someone's gonna someone's gonna kill me if I butcher it. Is it Strange Country? It's one of his written works where he's got a character that walks in. It's been so long since I thought about this. Character walks into the bar and asks for a Pernod Fils and says, but no, not the Spanish stuff, the original. Do you have any of that? So obviously, that even then, people made a distinction.
Right.
I mean, Pernod Tarragona, which is a fine product, I drink it all day long, but it wasn't quite the same
Right.
as a Pernod Fils. Yeah, they came from Pontarlier. They are different. Same name, produced under contract, but it just goes to show you, even if you have the same, assuming that the basic recipe was the same, it doesn't matter. Different location, different people, different equipment. Some
Yep.
of the botanicals, no doubt, came from different places and different product.
Right. Yeah, I'd be curious. I would love to see pictures from that old Tarragona factory, which I've
I,
never seen pictures from that. And it'd be interesting to see it, when Pernod had worked, because they got it first, right? They knew the band was coming. They subcontracted out and started already producing in Tarragona, and then eventually Pernod Fils buys it out in whatever the late 20s, and they switch it over. That's when Banus comes on. You can always tell the Pernod Ward labels because they don't have his name on them, and of course they continue producing up until the war shut them down in '36. But I'd love to see images from that old Paragon or the old Tarragona distillery.
I think I have a few actually um, buried in the archives here. I don't think that's my imagination. I think I have a few. It
Yeah.
doesn't look like Pernod Fils and Pontarlier, but what
Oh, I
does?
oh I can imagine. I can also imagine they just packed up a bunch of their older stills and shipped them over, like Combier. That when Pernod Fils burned down, I imagine a lot of folks bought. You know,
I don't know about that. In fact, I'm inclined to say, I can't remember exactly what's in the photos, but I'm inclined to say no.
Yeah, I could believe it. I mean, and again, people forget that absinthe stills aren't just absinthe stills. You need colorators and all kinds of. It's a very unique process that you just can't switch your gin production over one day to do absinthe. It really requires highly specialized equipment that I think most people have never seen an absinthe colorator before. But without an absinthe colorator, it is you can really botch that whole process.
You change any piece of key equipment and you will change the product.
Yeah. Yep.
In there, done that, understand it. Could have written a book on it, but I
Yep.
didn't. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Ted,
it's sensitive stuff, man.
yeah, man. Oh, I've been on both sides of it, so I know something about it. Not as much as you, obviously. You're the real master distiller of this, but Ted, I
Devil's in
want
the
to.
details.
Yes, yes. He always is.
Yeah.
Uh, Ted, don't take up too much more of your time, but hey, brother, thank you for the work you've done, both demystifying absinthe, but also producing world class absinthe as chemically similar to vintage absinthe as humanly possible. I really just want to thank you on the part of absinthe drinkers everywhere for the work you've done, for the work that you're doing, and yeah, I hope you have a wonderful absinthe day.
It's a dirty job, but someone had to do it.
It's true. It smells good though. I mean, um, uh, all right, Ted. Well, I appreciate you, man, and hopefully we can catch up some other time and maybe have a glass of absinthe together.
That would be great. Good to see you, Justin. You
You
take
too,
care.
bro. Take it easy. All right, everybody. Well, I hope you can join me after this, where my friend and absinthe colleague, another absinthe colleague, Adrian LeVay, are going to be trying the exact absinthe that Ted and I have been talking about. Adrian, also, you guys knows Ted as well. We're going to be trying vintage Pernod Edward and Ted's recreation of it. back to back, which I don't think happens too terribly often. And
Mm-mm.
so we're going to be sampling them back to back to get a sense of what they're like and how they're different and how they're the same. And we won't be too hard on you, Ted. We'll cut you some slack.
I can't put 100 years on it, but yeah, I mean, it definitely you definitely taste the age, especially depends on what sample you're getting. Are you getting a 60% or a 65?
It's being pulled out of a bottle of Pernod. What is it? I think it's a 60. I can tell you in a second. It's pulled out of actually a bottle of the Spanish mark. So it's one of the ones from the late 20s. I think it's the
Oh, okay,
60.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that'll be fun. That'll be fun
Yeah.
because yeah, that'll be quite an interesting comparison. Quite an
Right.
interesting comparison.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think they're again. It's not quite the same as the French stuff, which
Yeah,
but it's interesting in its own right. And also
absolutely.
it's also what I had. It's not like I can pull too much 100-year-old absinthe just out of the blue. So,
Well, who can?
all right.
Not many.
You
Not
work
many
you
of
work
us.
you work with what you got. Ted, where can folks find you? Where can folks pick up a bottle of the Edward or any of the stock of absinthe that you produce? Where can they find you?
Well, let's see. Depends on where you are. It depends where you're located.
Sure.
If you're located in the United States or some states where I do have a distribution of Jade liqueurs, you can always go to the Jade website, send us an email inquiry, and we'll let you know if it's distributed in your state. If not, and you are in the U.S., you can still usually order it from Alandia.com, which is a retailer in Germany that ships very reliably to the U.S. So that avenue is there. And of course, and you're in Europe, well, it depends on what country you're in. But if you're in France, Jade is at the best bottle shops: Italy, Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, and UK, definitely, and the best shops in London. Jade's around. It's not always easy to find, depending upon where you are. But if you send us an email, we'll get you oriented, put you in the right direction.
Awesome. Yeah, folks, pick up a bottle
Or find
of
us on
uh,
Facebook.
of the or on Facebook, and also you can get the 375s too. So if you're not willing to commit to a whole full bottle of absinthe,
It's a
you can
Yeah.
get the smaller
There's a
bottles as well.
200s. They're 200 ml bottles. Yeah, the small bottles are actually 200s. They're
Nice,
available in Europe, but we're bringing them into the United States in 2023. So
nice.
that's plan. We're working on it now. Yeah,
Awesome. Yeah, so you can get a bottle, and again, it's not inexpensive, but it's well worth the price to really experience really a taste of history. So I really think that that's well worth the experience. Okay, Ted, well, I'll let you go, man, and appreciate you. And yeah, folks, stick around for tasting of some vintage absinthe and Ted's recreation here on the channel in just a few. Take it easy, Ted.
have fun.